and he joins us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Nathan, good to see you this afternoon. So the first question is, what might a Kamala Harris White House and administration mean when it comes to policies and changes from what we saw or are seeing with a Biden administration, a Biden White House?
Yeah, so that's a great question. You know, we're telling clients this election was really about three things. The first is tariffs, second is taxes, and the third is the sector impacts. Now, when it comes to tariffs, you know, you have this binary choice between President Trump, who has said 60% tariffs on items from China, but Kamala Harris, as a senator, was somewhat skeptical of the Canadian-U.S.-Mexico agreement and also the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and largely due to climate change concerns. So there's a little bit of difference between her and Biden on tariffs. When it comes to taxes, well, you know, we actually view that President Biden moved closer to Kamala Harris's positions on taxes than she did to his when he became president. So I would anticipate a continued focus on lower to middle income consumers, because remember, the Trump-era tax cuts expire at the tail end of 2025, and there's going to be a lot of tax debate on how to keep those going forward, which I think is what Kamala Harris would want to do. And then when it comes to the sector impacts, when it comes to banks, EVs, TMT, technology, antitrust concerns, it's largely status quo, because a lot of the regulatory leadership that President Biden has in place right now, we think is very indicative of what a Kamala Harris presidency would look like. And because a lot of those proposals are already underway, the first 2 years of her administration, if she was elected, I think would be finalization of those proposals.
To be fair, I mean, doesn't it make a difference in terms of what happens in Congress too, right, when we think about policy changes?
Absolutely. I mean, when it comes to that, it's essentially that's in the tax debate. It's called reconciliation. If the Republicans or the Democrats, let's say the Democrats have a great night, if they have the House, the Senate, and the presidency, you can use this process called reconciliation to essentially do what you will on tax reform. This is how the Trump-era tax cuts got through. This is how Obamacare got through. This is how the Inflation Reduction Act gets through. But if you have a gridlock Congress, then obviously that type of broad fiscal spending, other injection into the economy or a tax incentive or a tax cut aspect somewhat becomes narrowed. And so if you have a gridlock Congress, you have a lot of these grandiose ideas out there, but you are going to need Republican or bipartisan or Democratic support, whoever is the president, to get that through. And as a result, it's more nuanced changes, nuanced sector impacts and so forth, rather than grandiose plans.
I do wonder, Nathan, at this point, listen, it's 24 hours roughly, right, since we got the news of President Biden yesterday saying that he wasn't going to run for a second term. Having said that, actually, folks, we're going to head to D.C. and that we have House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries making some comments. Let's listen in.
When President Biden and Vice President Harris first took office on January 20th of 2021, the Biden-Harris team assumed a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a democracy crisis in the immediate aftermath of January 6th at the same time. And thanks to the leadership of President Joe Biden and his partnership with Vice President Kamala Harris, they were able to rescue
All right, obviously having a technical problem. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries making some comments from the Capitol. We'll try and take you back there. And let's see, do we have it again, guys? Yep, sounds like it. Let's take you back to D.C., everybody. And
in a decade or so recession-like situation and set us on a positive path so that everyday Americans could thrive in every single zip code across America. Thanks to the leadership of President Biden and his partnership with Vice President Harris, dignity and decency and a democratic way of life was restored to the Oval Office and 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. We owe a debt of gratitude to President Biden for his tremendous leadership, and I'm also thankful for the incredible partnership that he has had for the last 3.5 years with Vice President Kamala Harris.
Leader Jeffries, first, will you endorse Kamala Harris? And then I have one other question for you.
Well, Leader Xu and I are scheduled to meet with Vice President Harris shortly. The House came back into session today. The Senate does not come back into session tomorrow. I'm excited for that meeting. And let me say this, that Vice President Kamala Harris has excited the community. She's excited the House Democratic Caucus, and she's exciting the country. And so I'm looking forward to sitting down with her in person in short order with Leader Schumer, and we'll have more to say about the path forward as soon as that meeting concludes.
Quick question. What does President Biden need to do these final few months to ease the path to help, while he's in office, to ease the path to make it easier for Democrats to flip the House and to keep the White House?
Well, President Biden is going to continue to do his job. And he's put the country first. He's put the American people first. He's put hard-working American taxpayers first, which is what President Biden has always done. And as a result of his leadership, we've seen transformational change, fixing our crumbling bridges, roads, tunnels, airports, our sewer and water systems, rescuing the economy from the once-in-a-century pandemic, gun safety legislation for the first time in 30 years, standing up for our veterans, bringing domestic manufacturing jobs back home to the country, and passing the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest investment in combating the climate crisis in the history of the world. We still have more work to do. We still have to lower costs. We still have to end price gouging. We have to continue to grow the middle class, defend democracy, and fight for reproductive freedom. President Biden will continue to do that job along with Vice President Harris and Democrats in the House and the Senate.
This has been a few weeks of very intense discussions about Biden being at the top of the ticket. What light can you shed to the American public about the concerns that you conveyed to the president about staying on the top of the ticket?
It's a private conversation with President Joe Biden that will remain private.
Mr. Leader, I mean, there has been a lot of reporting about what was said and wasn't. So just for the record, can you just be clear? Did you ever tell the president that he could hurt Democrats' chances at taking back the majority if he stayed in the race? And secondly, what do you say to those, whether it's Ron Klain or congressional Republicans, who claim that Democratic Party leaders or elected officials pushed the president out?
President Joe Biden is a heroic, patriotic, and transformational figure. And he will go down in history as one of the greatest public servants of all time. That much is clear. I had a private conversation with President Biden to express the perspectives that were wide-ranging of the House Democratic Caucus. That conversation will remain private. In terms of my Republican colleagues, former President Donald Trump and extreme MAGA Republicans are having a meltdown right now. A complete and total meltdown. Why? Because their presidential nominee is unpopular. The extreme MAGA Republican policies are unpopular, including trying to impose a nationwide abortion ban on the American people. And their Project 2025 is unpopular. They're having a meltdown right now. All we want to do as Democrats is have a debate about moving the country forward and continuing to put people over politics.
Can you speak for just a moment to what the concerns you were hearing from members, in swing districts who were concerned about the president possibly dragging down ballot, and how this potentially changes that equation by changing the top of the ticket?
Here's what we're looking forward to. We are going to do everything we need to do as House Democrats to win back control of the House of Representatives and vacate the extreme MAGA Republican majority on November 5th.
When is that meeting? Today, tomorrow?
We're waiting on Leader Schumer to get back into town, as well as to get exact confirmation from Vice President Harris. Thanks.
All right, everybody, you have been listening to House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries up there on Capitol Hill, making some brief comments. Did mention that leadership is expected to, the Democratic leadership, to meet with Vice President Harris shortly, and we'll have more to say after that meeting, but also has talked about the Vice President being kind of exciting the community, the Democratic caucus specifically, and the country. So making some comments, and also, of course, making some comments also about the Republicans.
Yeah, he did say that Republicans are having a, quote, meltdown. He called them extreme MAGA Republican policies are unpopular. He mentioned Project 2025 being unpopular, and he said that all we want to do is have a debate about moving the country forward.
All right, so we will await, of course, his meeting with the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and of course with the Vice President Kamala Harris, and look for some more comments after that. In the meantime, let's get back to Bloomberg's Nathan Dean, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Government Analyst, still with us from our D.C. Bureau. Hey, Nathan, like you, like all of us, we continue to listen to various comments, certainly right now from the Democratic Party. How do you kind of parse through what's being said politically as you try to figure out what might be impacting policy, rules, regulations, things that are important to the Bloomberg audience right now?
Yeah, so, when President Trump announces his intentions, a lot of it is rolling back President Biden-era regulations or legislative achievements. And so Representative Jeffries right there just mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, which piqued my interest because, the Inflation Reduction Act is one of those big, grandiose pieces of legislation that is not only applicable to healthcare and tax reform, but also applicable to the clean energy sector. And so my colleague Rob Barnett actually put out a note this morning talking about what Kamala Harris would do to the Inflation Reduction Act. And essentially, not only would she support it, potentially she would go back and even boost it. So, the renewable industry is something that we've been looking at in terms of a high catalyst event with the election, because if President Trump comes in, you have this tendency that you may be able to roll back the IRA, tweak it, adjust it, amend a lot of the clean energy CapEx spending that, these companies like First Solar have planned over the next few years. But Kamala Harris on the other side would actually go and enhance it and boost it. So, there's a lot of politics and a lot of headlines getting thrown around there. But we ultimately just have to ask, these statements come out, these questions come out, how do you get it through Washington?
Nathan, what about when it comes to energy, for example, and what happens to energy companies under a Kamala Harris administration versus a President Trump administration?
Yeah, so, the thing here is we often tell our clients to remember that there are three ways that things get through Washington. First is legislation. You don't need to be me to know that gridlock happens in Congress all the time. The second is regulation. There's a lot of rules coming out from the EPA, for example. But regulation is a little bit different because regulation, yes, you can bypass the opposite party, but you have to use this process called the Administrative Procedures Act, which takes time. If President Trump were to win, you're looking at probably 2 to 3 years to roll back some of the Biden-era regulations. That's also notwithstanding that maybe the courts are going to overturn you in light of some of recent Supreme Court actions. But for the energy sector in particular, I would stress the third way, which is executive orders. Now, President Trump comes in, expect a lot of executive orders. Most of them are symbolic in nature. They're fancy ways of the president picking up the phone and saying, I direct my agencies to do these regulatory rulemakings. But there's always this headline risk, or that other 15%, which is like the LNG pause and so forth, where the power of the presidency is more powerful. So the energy sector does have some aspect that falls into that executive order bucket. I think the risk is there if President Trump wins. If Vice President Kamala Harris wins, it's more of a continuation of the status quo.
Hey, to be fair, it is a race, still expected to be a very close race, whoever it ultimately is come November. You, as a policy analyst, are, I'm assuming, continuing to look at both sides and both outcomes, whether it's a Republican win or a Democratic win.
That's correct. I mean, the way to do this is scenario analysis. And so we have for example, we have this matrix on the terminal called the BI election matrix, and you can look at the Trump scenario versus the Democratic scenario because, Vice President Kamala Harris is not the nominee yet. Mm-hmm. If she is the nominee, it'll be the Harris scenario. But in conducting this scenario analysis, you have to look at what the makeup of Congress is. Like we mentioned before, if it's reconciliation, well, President Trump could potentially repeal a good portion of the IRA without Democrats, any type of opposition. If there is gridlock, it means legislation odds actually come down. So as you tend to think about the election and how you prepare for it as an investor, think of this: scenario analysis, process, and procedure. Because whether it's legislation, regulation, or executive order, generally there's a process associated with this. And generally, you do get about 6, 9, 12 months before the actual final catalyst takes place. And so you can actually then plan accordingly to that.
Well, you've set us up so well for our next conversation. Nathan Dean, thank you so much. He's Bloomberg Intelligence